So I just want to reiterate what I was saying in the last little lecture there. The fact that Timothy Findley's novel is about the war, but it is a powerful anti-war message that is sort of behind his narrative. So he depicts the inhumanity and destructive nature of warfare and how it not only, takes the lives of men, but damages them psychologically and really sort of stole the innocence away from them, of that generation of men. So some of what Findley does is sort of to depict the technology that was advancing at the time through the weapons of war. And he'll have scenes that depict quite vividly the use of warfare, different types of warfare. There's a scene where Robert and his men experience mustard gas, and they're attacked with gas warfare, and they must survive even though the military has not supplied them with gas masks. Robert thinks quickly and acts in that instant and is able to save some of his men. Trench mortars, you'll hear that terminology in the novel while you're reading. That's sort of they send missiles to the other line through mortars, so shells. And then this was also the first time that airplanes and zeppelins were used in war. And then finally, liquid warfare. I want to mention flamethrowers as being another military technology that was advanced during this time. And in the novel, there's a scene where one of the characters named Rodwell experiences men who have used the flamethrowers. They were right on the front lines, or they experienced watching the Germans use the flamethrowers, and they saw all the devastation that occurred from those, and this has traumatized them to a point of sort of no return. So it is a tragic circumstance that these men have faced inhumanities that they can't really heal from. So I'll just show you a picture of the flamethrower in action. So here you can see flames shooting from this sort of like hose, and you can imagine the damage that would do to your fellow soldiers. So again, very sort of traumatic for the men who experienced this firsthand. As you can imagine, when faced with the sort of inhuman atrocities that were going on all around them on the battlefield, and the unprecedented amount of death that was occurring using this new technology, these so-called advancements of society through this warfare, men were suffering not just physically, right? Wounds are physical reminders of the war, but there are also sort of scars that go much deeper. And we can think about the sort of psychological toll of warfare, and in particular this idea of shell shock. So different characters in the novel will sort of exemplify characteristics of or symptoms of shell shock. The soldiers that Findley depicts have different symptoms. So some react just by sort of going numb. Some react by becoming sort of ultra violent and lashing out in that way. Some start, torturing animals because they have become sort of inhuman themselves and have lost any sort of sense of decency. Robert experiences his own sort of shell shock, and the symptoms vary. We've already talked a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder in women in this class, which is kind of interesting. Here's a parallel with how men were sort of diagnosed with a form of hysteria, and this would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, and it resulted from the experience of being traumatized from everything that you were seeing, the death that was all around you. And as we know now, this had, long-reaching after effects, psychological after effects. So maybe you didn't you weren't sort of shell-shocked in the moment, but months would go by, you'd be on your release from duty, and then you would have a sort of nervous breakdown. And these psychiatric institutions or convalescent centers were opened to treat the men who were, they became sort of suffering from symptoms related to shell shock. So the post-traumatic stress of being a soldier. And we'll see some different depictions of that in the story. So Findley not only sort of emphasizes or reinforces this anti-war message by depicting soldiers' characters as shell-shocked, he also sort of reiterates the point by suggesting that the military sort of system is dehumanizing the soldiers themselves and treating them as sort of tools. They're merely just sort of expendable objects that perpetuate this military system. And without them, the war couldn't occur, but it's not important that they have a name or a character or a personality. They are just sort of soldiers, right? They are expendable young men, and they're just, again, working as tools of this military system. Who benefits from that are the sort of powerful lawmakers, the sort of nationalistic governments that are, have something at stake in this war, whether it be territory or power or whatever you want to call it. They're the ones benefiting and exploiting these generations of young men who are sort of told that it's part of their nationalistic duty, to be a patriot of your country, you have to serve. And if you lose your life, it's sort of a meaningful death because there's glory in being a soldier and dying. So young men would buy into this idea, this propaganda. And Findley is really sort of showing us the other side of that there was sort of no glory to die. And when men are treated as expendable, there's only tragedy, right, and suffering that occurs. And I think he really reiterates this by blurring the line between humans and animals. He'll have men and horses sort of drawn together and connected throughout the novel, in Robert's case in particular, but horses were also sort of, millions of horses were sent over to also sort of fight alongside the men. And this is sort of something we don't really realize when we think about World War I, that animals were greatly involved in the actual warfare. So horses in particular, but dogs, there were messenger pigeons, there were all types of sort of animals that were the innocent victims and also used as sort of tools by the military. So Findley is sort of reiterating this dehumanizing of the men by this military system by aligning horses and men and blurring those lines a little bit in this narrative. And here's two side-by-side pictures of how men were sort of thrown into these mass graves, just like the horses that died were sort of buried one on top of another. So they become sort of the collateral damage, I guess, of this military project of the government. And again, it's tragic the way that human beings were exploited and viewed as sort of an expendable tool just for this sort of, greedy, kind of self-centered military project or political project of warfare in World War I. So this is an interesting statistic as well. So 8 million horses died between both sides of the war. So horses were also sort of seen as this expendable object that, it didn't matter whether it lived or died, whether it did its duty and served sort of as a tool of the military was all that sort of mattered. And Robert has this strong connection with horses, and he seems to sort of identify with them in some way, some regard, and this will become really central to his character near the end when we find out what he has done, this sort of infamous moment in his life while he was a soldier, what actually occurred. I won't sort of give you a spoiler now, but as you continue reading and read to the end, Robert's connection with horses becomes very much evident. It's also tied somewhat to sort of masculine sexuality or Robert's sexuality as well. Horses are part of his identity, and every sort of facet of his identity is sort of tied to this symbol of the horse. So I was just going to mention, just to wrap up this short lecture, there are sort of other interesting textual or interactions between this text and other texts that we can look at. And we might consider some of the war poetry that also sort of was written at this time by a few soldiers. So you might have studied maybe in high school Dulce Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, or some of the poetry by Siegfried Sassoon, and I'm sure all of you know In Flanders Fields. So these type of this poetry that sort of was originated in World War I often is sort of viewed as anti-war poetry, right? So the poem by Wilfred Owen, Dulce Decorum Est, has this sort of message and depicts some of the sort of graphic, horrific imagery of what it's like to slog through the mud and experience a gas attack and to lose one of your men. So all of this is sort of reiterated in this poetry that does not sort of glorify war in any regard. It gives a very realistic portrayal of what was occurring on the front lines of the battlefield. And then Wilfred Owen he was sort of criticized for writing poetry that was very real, right? Because most of the poetry that occurred before the war was very much glorifying what it was to be a hero and to die for your country, and how much honor and bravery it took to be that kind of man. And here was Wilfred Owen saying, no, there is no, it's a lie, right? You're just buying into this lie, this propaganda. There is no glory in dying. It's not sweet or honorable to die for one's country, right? It's just tragic. It's just suffering. And a lot of the sort of soldiers, including, as we'll see, Robert Ross and other men, they became sort of disillusioned with being a soldier, right? Because they were fighting for something they couldn't understand. And that sort of dream of glory and dying for your country sort of lost its meaning and purpose once they saw, innocent lives being taken everywhere, right? So people were losing their lives, innocent people, and there was just sort of death and suffering all around them. All your friends died and or wounded. So they became disillusioned, and this was evident in a lot of the writing that was coming up at this time. So Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, and they were actually treated for shell shock themselves, and you could be, sort of court-martialed and even killed if you were viewed as a traitor. And they had to sort of, Wilfred Owen had to sort of defend his insanity in a way, or say he was sort of had temporary insanity for being such an patriotic soldier, even though he no longer believed in the war, right? So he had to sort of protect himself from being sort of military court-martialed and suffer the consequences of no longer believing in the cause. So there was a lot riding on whether or not you were viewed as a patriot or not. And sometimes your life was on the line in that regard as well. So you could be tried and murdered by your own sort of